You want to buy a Porsche Cayman but also want to be smart with your money.
Perhaps you're wondering which model depreciates the least or where the depreciation curve flattens.
Just paying a little bit of attention to these things can save you a ton of money.
In this video we'll uncover the latest depreciation statistics for the Caymans and figure out which model is the best buy from a value-conscious perspective.
First we'll look at the price trends for all generations and models and compare them to the general market trend.
After all, a Cayman might not be a good buy if you compare it to the rest of the market.
Second, we'll look where the depreciation curve flattens and highlight which mileage range is the optimal to minimize depreciation.
But let's first have a look at the price trends. We start with the 987s and then work our way up to the 718s.
Over here we have the price trends for the 987.1 base and S models. We can see that prices drifted lower from the pandemic market top in 2022, but that the overall trend is extremely stable. Base models are down by 2.4% compared to last year, and S's are up by 0.3%. These changes aren't statistically confirmed, so this means that they could be the result of chance because we're looking at market snapshots. For the .2 market, I grouped the base and S models together because there are so few of them for sale. We can see a similar stable trend since 2025. Median prices fluctuate just under $40,000. They are down by 4.9% compared to last year, but you need to interpret this number in line with the historical trend and the low supply levels. Supply for the R is even lower, but based on these low levels, we can see decreasing prices after the pandemic price stop and a recovery in 2024. This means that the year-over-year change is 7.6%, but as you might expect, this is not statistically confirmed. Continuing with the 981s, I need to start with an administrative message. The average mileage of the cars that were for sale fluctuated tremendously during last year, and some of that fluctuation is reflected in the price trends. It seems that GTSs are way up and SS and base models slightly down. But corrected for these changes in market composition, we can see that base models are down by 4.4%, S's by 1.5%, and GTSs up by 1.2%. You can see that the 981 market moves relatively slowly and is indeed down from the 2020 market top, but that the recent development displays relatively flat trends.
We'll continue now with the 718 and then have a look at the GT4s.
Over here we have the trend for the base, S and 4-cylinder GTS models. Prices decreased slightly more since the market top compared to the other generations, but the trends are still fairly stable. Last year base models lost 3.4%, S's 2.4% and GTS's 4.7%. Pretty decent results. I didn't include the T's here because they're quite rare. Taking the average of all these rates should give you a decent estimate.
Now what's interesting is that supply levels for 718 Caymans decreased for a long time, up until 2024.
We can see that supply increased for all models, and these aren't old cars that are put up for sale. These are new to almost new cars from model year 2024 or 2025. What's visible here in the data is backed up by Porsche's sales numbers. They sold 25% more 718 Cayman and Boxsters in 2024 than in 2023. Potentially this surge could be attributed to the disappearance of the ICE Cayman. In case you haven't heard, the next Cayman will be fully electric. One thing to keep in mind though is that the new 718s that came to the market have a higher depreciation rate than the older ones. You're looking at 8 to 10% for the new ones.
Let's have a look now at the 4-liter GTSs and the GT4s.
We can see that 718 GT4 prices at the top over here were stable for a long time. Moreover, prices hardly declined after the pandemic top. During last year though, the market softened a bit and prices turned south. Not by much, but it's a clear trend change compared to what we saw before. We're looking at a drop of 4.8%. 4-liter GTSs and 981 GT4s were more stable during last year. The GT4 is down by 1.5% and the 4-liter GTS is up by 0.2%. None of these changes are confirmed, so they can be the result of chance. Now I think it's noteworthy to highlight the price strength in the 981 GT4 market. Prices are basically at the same level as during the pandemic market top. There are only a few other cars to which this applies.
There's one car left, the GT4 RS.
The depreciation pattern for this car is completely different than what we've seen so far. Prices are decreasing rapidly and are doing so in a linear way. Last year, prices dropped by 13.6%, and due to the high pricing level, this amounts to roughly $33,000.
Let's now combine all the data that we saw. We flicked through quite many charts and numbers.
Looking at all the data, we can see that the average decline in the Cayman market was minus 2.5%. Most cars, however, lost between minus 4.6 and 0%. Is this a good or a bad result? I think it's decent. The average market decline was 4%, and most cars lost between 9 and 1%. So this means that the Cayman definitely falls on the favorable side of the depreciation scale.
But what do you do with this information as a value-conscious buyer? Which model will depreciate the least?
As we discussed, there's some fluctuations in these numbers because supply is low for these cars. The rate for the R is probably overestimated. Likewise, many new 718 base and S's came to the market, and if you buy a new one, you'll experience a higher depreciation rate than displayed here. Nevertheless, in general, the conclusion is that all of the used Cayman models, with exception of a few, are decent buys from a value perspective. There are some differences between the models, but these are relatively small. Zooming into these differences, it is the 981 that seems to be at the sweet spot. The cars are a lot newer than the 987s and depreciated at the same rate or even less. The only car you should steer clear of if you care about residuals is the 718 GT4 RS. Yet, the market improved from the minus 18% that we saw before. The curve is flattening slowly, but with minus 13% the model still falls in the top 25% of quickest depreciating cars.
So let's say you decided you want the Cayman. The depreciation rates seem reasonable. But all of the rates we looked at are averages. In some cases there are differences within the model. Low mileage cars, for example, lose value much quicker. And assuming that you want to use your car a lot, buying such a low mileage example might not be the best idea.
So where is that magical sweet spot where the curve flattens? Let's have a look.
Oh, and before I forget, we're looking at mileage instead of model year because model year hardly affects the price of the Caymans, with exception of a few 718s.
If we look at the miles to price relationship for the 97.1 base and S models, we can see that it doesn't matter all that much what mileage your car has. If you add 1000 miles, cars with a mileage between 40 and 80,000 miles will drop at approximately the same rate. On average, this is 0.6 to 0.7% per 1000 miles driven. Sure, if you go over 100,000 miles, there's a minor flattening, but the effect is only small.
The 987.2 market is too small for such type of analysis, so let's continue now with the 981.
In the 981 market, we can see that the curve flattens slightly more than in the 987.1 market. On average, these models lose between 0.4 and 0.5% per 1000 miles driven. When you start to look at the base and S models with 70,000 miles or more, you're closer to the 0.4%, and the lower mileage examples are closer to 0.5%. For the GTSs, we can't see this, but that's because we don't have enough data for the high mileage examples.
Now, is this flattening of the curve actually meaningful? Personally, I don't think you should put too much weight on it. All 981s have an extremely low mileage sensitivity, so as long as you avoid the lowest mileage examples, you should be good. You need to pay attention though if you're buying a 718 base or S.
The situation is different over here and we need to take a moment to unpack this. On average, 718s lose around 1 to 1.1% per 1000 miles driven. This is much more than the 987s and 981s and is primarily caused by the large share of new cars that entered the market. Remember that we talked about increasing sales for the Caymans? These cars over here are mainly young 718s, which of course have a low mileage. It's clear that buying one of these might not be the most value-conscious decision, as values drop quickly when mileage is added. It's only around 30,000 miles that the number drops significantly, so I would look for a car in that area if you want to use it a lot. Finally, we have the GT4s and the 4-liter GTSs. Starting with the 718s, it's clear that you need to avoid everything with less than roughly 8,000 miles. Prices plummet quickly. 4-liter GTSs start, for example, at the same price as a 981 GT4, but then decrease much quicker than the GT4 and end up priced lower. Roughly 15,000 miles seems to represent a point at which the curve starts to flatten. The flattening for the 718 GT4 is less profound but happens at approximately the same mileage. The pattern for the 981 GT4 is completely different. After 10,000 miles the line is relatively flat. This makes sense given the age of the car.
So which Cayman should you buy if you're a value-conscious buyer?
First, you should buy whatever you like. Second, if you buy any 981 or 987 and avoid the lowest mileage examples, you're making a reasonable value-conscious choice. Yes, the cars will still depreciate, but relatively little compared to the rest of the market. In the 718 market, you need to pay a bit more attention. Despite a decreasing depreciation rate in the GT4 RS market, that model is still best to be avoided. The other 718s of course depreciate still quicker than the 981s and 718s, but it are especially the latest model years that should be avoided. For base and S models, a car with roughly 30,000 miles, and for the 4-liter GTSs and GT4s, an example with 10 to 15,000 miles, are likely to provide good trade-offs between mileage and value loss.
And with that we arrived at the end of the video. Now if you enjoy this data-driven way of analyzing car prices but would like to see a video for a different car, head over to my channel. Over there you'll find data-driven market analysis for a large variety of cars. Can't find the car you're looking for? Let me know the name of the car by commenting it down below in the comment section. Once there are enough requests for a certain car, I'll make a video about it. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks for a fresh market update.